All right, let's dive in today and get ready because we're tackling something pretty huge, something that's been a core concept in political philosophy for centuries, really,
Yeah.
republicanism.
Yeah.
And especially since you're coming at this from a philosophy angle, we're going to really try to break it down, all the nuances and the intricacies of republicanism.
Yeah.
We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our main source today. So get ready for things like non-domination and the very definition of freedom, all that good stuff.
Yeah, excited to jump in. You're right. Republicanism, it's not just some historical thing, it gives us a really unique way to look at freedom and power, especially how we think about politics today.
For sure, for sure. I guess, first things first. What even is republicanism? We hear the word all the time, especially these days, but what does it really mean from a philosophical standpoint?
Yeah, that's true. And it's even trickier because the word republicanism can actually mean two different things. First, you have, the historical tradition. We're talking Machiavelli, Montesquieu, even the American founders, guys like that. Their big thing was civic virtue, public service, and how dangerous corruption can be. They were really drawing on those old school classical models of republics.
Gotcha. So that first type, classical republicanism, it's all about virtuous citizens and a government that really works for everybody, for the common good. What about that second meaning you mentioned?
That second meaning is where things get really interesting, especially for philosophers today. It's what we call civic republicanism. It's like a modern take on that classical tradition, and scholars like Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit have been huge in bringing this to the forefront. What civic republicanism is really all about is this idea of freedom as non-domination.
Okay, non-domination, now we're talking. That definitely needs some explaining. How is that different from, say, the typical liberal view of freedom, like freedom from interference?
That's the key question. This is where the philosophy really gets real. So liberals, they usually think of freedom as no outside limits on your actions, right? If no one's actively stopping you from doing something, then you're free. But civic Republicans, they say, hold on, that's not the whole picture. You could have zero interference, but still not be free if you're under someone else's arbitrary power.
So it's not just about what you can actually do, but who's really calling the shots, those power dynamics behind the scenes.
Exactly. Imagine a slave owner, right? But he's super nice, treats his slaves well, doesn't have tons of rules. A liberal might look at that and say, hey, those slaves are pretty free. They're not facing a lot of interference. But a civic Republican would say, whoa, wait a minute. There's still this massive power imbalance. The slave's entire life depends on the master's good mood, basically. Anything they have could be taken away just like that. They have no power to push back, to challenge that authority. And that's domination, even if it's not actively cruel or anything.
Wow, that's a really striking example. Domination can be so subtle, can it? It doesn't have to be violent or coercive to be really powerful. But I'm wondering, wouldn't you run into the same issue in, I don't know, other relationships where there's a power imbalance? What about parents and kids?
Oh, you've hit on something that's a big debate among Republican theorists, for sure. You're right. Parents and kids, there's a definite power difference. And some level of, I guess you could say, domination is probably needed to, raise kids. But civic Republicans would say there's a key difference here. With good parenting, the goal is to gradually reduce that domination as the kid grows up, right? You want to help them become independent, to make their own choices without someone constantly controlling them. That's not how it works with slavery, where that domination is baked into the whole relationship.
I see. It's not about just getting rid of all power imbalances, but about making sure those imbalances have a good reason, a purpose, and they're used to help the person, become more free and independent in the end.
Exactly. And that takes us right to the heart of civic republicanism, this idea of arbitrary power. That's where things get really, really interesting, especially from a philosophical angle.
I'm all ears. So how do civic Republicans define arbitrary power? It feels slippery.
Yeah.
I mean, couldn't even a ruler with good intentions end up acting arbitrarily just based on their own personal whims?
That's such a good point, and it gets at the core of what makes power arbitrary. It's not just about whether their actions are random or unpredictable. Like you said, a ruler could have the best intentions and still act on a whim, and that's still a form of arbitrariness. For civic Republicans, what makes the difference is whether that power is limited by rules and procedures, things that everyone knows and agrees on, especially those who are being ruled. It's about whether the people have a say in how that power is used over them.
So it's not just about the decisions themselves, but how those decisions are made. It's about the process.
You got it. There are two main ways civic Republicans define arbitrariness. First, procedurally. If a ruler's power isn't checked by laws, norms, institutions, then it's arbitrary. Picture like a king who can throw anyone in jail without a trial or change the laws whenever he feels like it. Classic arbitrary power. The second way is democratically. If the people being ruled have no say in how that power is used, then that's also arbitrary.
So to avoid being arbitrary, power has to be both rule-bound and democratically accountable. You can't just be one or the other. That's a pretty high bar.
It is high, and that's why civic republicans put so much emphasis on things like constitutions and democratic institutions. Those are the best ways to protect against arbitrary power.
This all makes sense when we're talking about government, but I'm curious how this idea of non-domination works in, other parts of life. Does civic republicanism have anything to say about social norms, the economy, even personal relationships?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where you really see how deep republicanism goes. It's not just a theory about government, it's a whole way of looking at power dynamics everywhere. The goal for a civic republican is to minimize arbitrary power, wherever it is, and create a society where everyone has the chance to live free from domination. It doesn't matter what your social status is, your background, your circumstances, any of that.
This is fascinating stuff, but it also seems incredibly hard to actually put into practice.
Yeah.
How do you build a society that really lives up to these ideals of like non-domination and civic virtue? Where do you even start?
Yeah, that's where the real work begins, right? And that's where the insights from civic republicanism become so valuable. It's not just lofty ideas, it's about really looking at how power works and finding ways to structure our institutions, even our social interactions, so that we minimize domination and give everyone the most freedom possible.
I definitely want to explore those practical applications more. But before we do, I think we need to unpack this idea of civic virtue a little bit more. It's a concept that, I don't know, it sometimes gets misinterpreted or even dismissed as kind of old-fashioned.
I agree, civic virtue is key to republicanism, but it definitely gets misunderstood. So let's break it down in part two, and we'll see how it fits into this vision of a society free from domination.
Okay, so picking up where we left off, we're talking about republicanism, and especially this idea of freedom as non-domination. But it seems like to actually make that happen, we need more than just the right ideas, right?
Right. It's one thing to lay out this ideal of non-domination, but how do you actually make it work? How do you create the right conditions for it? And that's where civic virtue comes in.
I gotta say, I've always been kind of iffy on civic virtue.
Okay.
It seems, I don't know, kind of vague and like asking a lot of people, are we all supposed to be like saints or something, constantly putting the common good above everything else? That doesn't sound very realistic or even appealing, honestly.
I get your skepticism, I do. But for civic Republicans, civic virtue, it's not about being some kind of perfect, self-sacrificing person. It's really more about recognizing that for a society based on non-domination to work, people need to act in certain ways, have certain dispositions.
Okay, so less about sainthood and more about being a responsible citizen, someone who knows their actions affect other people's freedom too.
Exactly. Think about it. What if everyone's always looking out for number one, trying to get ahead, even if it means screwing someone else over? What if corruption is just like everywhere? What if nobody wants to get involved in politics? Well, the whole system becomes really fragile, open to domination. It's like it could all just fall apart.
So civic virtue, it's about realizing that our freedoms are all tied together, right? We can't
Yep.
just be selfish. We have to do our part to keep the system working, the system that protects everyone from arbitrary power.
That's it, exactly. It's being willing to, call out injustice, hold our leaders accountable, participate in building a society that actually minimizes domination. It's a shared responsibility, basically.
That makes way more sense. It's not about never thinking about yourself, but about understanding that some behaviors, some attitudes, they're just essential for a free society to work right.
Exactly. Civic virtue, it's like realizing that freedom, it's a delicate thing. You got to be vigilant. You got to be active. You can't just assume it'll always be there.
So how does this idea of civic virtue play out in real life? What does it look like in terms of actual practices and policies?
That's where it gets exciting because civic republicanism, it doesn't just stay in the clouds, talking about abstract ideas. It actually gives you a framework for how to organize things, how to structure institutions and social norms in a way that promotes non-domination.
This is what I was getting at earlier. It can't just be about how individuals feel, right? There have to be actual systems in place that support those good intentions.
Absolutely. And that's why civic republicans are really into institutional design. They say the structure of our institutions, it's huge. It can either help or hurt civic virtue and non-domination.
So it's not enough to just tell people to be virtuous. You need to create a system where being virtuous is possible. where it's actually rewarded or incentivized.
Exactly. And one of the big ideas Republicans have is checks and balances, not just in government, but between the government and the people. They're all about what's called contestatory democracy, where citizens actually have the power to challenge their leaders, to hold them accountable.
That sounds a lot like the ideas behind the U.S. Constitution, right? With the separation of powers, checks and balances, all that.
You're seeing the connection. The people who wrote the Constitution, they were heavily influenced by Republican thinkers, especially Montesquieu. They knew how dangerous it was for power to be concentrated in one place and how important it was to divide it up so nobody could become a tyrant.
So they built a system where power is always being questioned, debated, negotiated, both inside the government and between the government and the people.
Exactly. It's designed to be suspicious of power and to encourage people to participate actively. And that's where civic virtue comes in. In a contestatory democracy, it's both a right and a responsibility to engage in public debate, scrutinize your leaders, hold them accountable.
It seems like a system that really relies on people being able to make good judgments, to act for the good of the community. It takes a lot of trust.
It does, and civic Republicans place a lot of value on public deliberation, the ability of citizens to come together and reason about what's best for everyone. They believe that through honest debate, even when people disagree, we can reach decisions that are fair and just, that minimize domination.
But what about people who try to game the system?
Yeah.
People who are corrupt, who abuse power. How do you stop that from happening in a contestatory democracy?
That's where those institutional safeguards we talked about earlier come in. A good Republican system, it'll have ways to prevent corruption, transparency in government, independent oversight bodies, a free press that can call out those in power, things like that.
It seems like republicanism is this balancing act, this careful dance. You have to empower citizens, but also guard against them being manipulated or the system being abused.
That's a great point. Republicanism, it's not a simple formula. It's a complex system, a dynamic system. It's about recognizing that power and freedom, they're always in tension, and trying to build institutions that resolve that tension as best as possible to create a society that's just and fair.
This has been so insightful. I'm really seeing how civic virtue and institutional design work together, how they support each other to create a society where non-domination is possible. But I can't help but wonder, how do all these principles apply to the world outside of a single country? We live in a globalized world with problems like climate change that go beyond national borders. Can republicanism offer any guidance for dealing with international relations?
That's a great question, and it's something that contemporary Republican theorists are really wrestling with. So let's take this conversation global in part 3 and see how republicanism tackles the challenges of a globalized world.
All right, so we've been digging deep into this whole idea of republicanism, especially how it sees freedom as non-domination. And we talked about civic virtue and building institutions that actually make that possible. But the thing that keeps coming back to me is, how does all of this fit into, like, the bigger picture, the world beyond just one country?
That is the question that's keeping a lot of Republican theorists up at night, I'll tell you. It's tough trying to reconcile this idea of republicanism, which has traditionally been about, a single republic, with a world where power doesn't stop at borders.
It's like we almost need a whole new way of looking at it, not just a philosophy for a nation, but for a planet, right?
Yeah.
Especially with things like climate change, human rights, these giant corporations with more power than some countries. It all feels so interconnected.
You're absolutely right. And some Republican thinkers, they say the best way forward is to focus on making individual republics as strong and as free as possible, almost like the building blocks for a better world order. The idea is if each country is truly free from domination internally, they'll be more likely to cooperate with each other, actually solve problems together.
It's a bottom-up approach, right? Start with a solid foundation, each nation doing its own thing, right? And hopefully that spreads outwards. But is that really enough? I mean, some problems are so big, so global.
Yeah, and that's the big debate. Critics say, hey, just having strong individual republics won't cut it for some things. You need coordinated action, everyone working together. Climate change, for example, it's not something any one country can fix on its own.
Which brings us to the idea of global governance. Can you even have something like that and still be true to Republican principles? I mean, wouldn't that just create like a new opportunity for domination, but on a massive scale?
That's the million-dollar philosophical puzzle. And some Republican thinkers, they're exploring ways to think about global governance where it's actually accountable to the people, where it doesn't become just another source of arbitrary power.
So still using those same ideas, right?
Yeah.
Checks and balances, transparency, making sure people can actually participate in decisions,
Yeah.
but doing it globally.
That's the idea. Imagine a world where global institutions, they're not just powerful, but they have to answer to the people they affect. Maybe things like, representatives from different countries, or ways for citizens around the world to challenge decisions made by these global bodies.
Which makes me think about the whole concept of citizenship, right?
Mm.
Traditionally, republicanism is all about belonging to a specific republic. But in a globalized world where people move around more, how does that work? Does that idea of citizenship need to change too?
Now you're really getting to the heart of it. It's a tough one. Some Republicans are saying, yeah, we need a more flexible idea of citizenship, something that recognizes that people belong to multiple communities at the same time, local, national, maybe even global. Others are grappling with how to balance the rights of citizens with the obligations we might have to people who aren't citizens who live in other countries.
And that leads right into the whole issue of migration, which is such a hot topic these days. Open borders versus national sovereignty, all of that. How does republicanism approach that whole debate?
Oh, that's a real hornet's nest. There's a huge range of views on that among Republican thinkers. Some say, look, countries do have a right to control their borders, especially if it's about protecting the very things that make a republic work, those institutions that guarantee freedom. Others focus on the fact that non-domination, it's a universal principle, right? It should apply to everyone, no matter where they live, whether they're a citizen or not.
It seems like the key is finding that balance. You know, how do you keep republics strong and functioning while also making sure that everyone, everywhere is treated fairly, is protected from domination?
That's the challenge, and that's what makes republicanism so relevant today. It's not just some set of dusty old rules. It's a tradition that's constantly evolving, trying to find answers to these tough questions in a world that's changing so fast.
This whole conversation has really shown me how much republicanism is like a work in progress. It's not about having all the answers. It's about having a framework, a set of values that can help us make sense of the world, especially when it comes to power, to freedom, to what kind of society, what kind of world we want to live in.
And that's what makes it so exciting for philosophers, right? Republicanism, it pushes us to think critically, to really examine these fundamental questions. It's not just about politics. It's about human dignity, about justice, about creating a world where everyone has the chance to live a good life, free from domination.
This deep dive has been, I don't know, it's really opened my eyes to how relevant republicanism still is. We've covered so much ground, from its history to how it might help us tackle the challenges of a globalized world. And for a philosophy enthusiast, it's a treasure trove of ideas, things to think about, to debate, to explore. So keep those philosophical gears turning, everyone, and until next time, keep diving deep.